Hello, everyone, and welcome to this 6G World webinar, which is a recap and talking about some of the chief lessons arising from the recent 6G Symposium fall at the end of September. My name's Alex Lawrence. I'm the managing editor of 6G World, and I'll be your host today. Now, a quick plug for 6G World. It's a forum for news, debates, research, and ideas to help the telecoms industry, academia, and government navigate successfully from the early days of 5G today through to the end of the decade and the early days of 6G. Now, if the 6G Symposium is any indication, we certainly have our work cut out for us. The symposium brought together more than 60 professionals with different perspectives to discuss and debate ways that North America can build a strong position in 6G with over 14 hours of content. We covered a wide variety of policy, business, and social issues, as well as technology, of course. Now, you can access all of this from the 6G World site, just clicking through to the 6G Symposium. But the coming hour is a lightning discussion of the key issues arising from the event and a look at how thinking about 6G is moving forward. With me to explore this are four thought leaders with different backgrounds, all of whom were closely involved with the event. Mike Nawrocki, the head of ATIS's Next G Alliance, and Michael O'Reilly, the former FCC commissioner, took part as keynote speakers. Meanwhile, Tomaso Melodia of Northeastern University and Doug Castor of InterDigital were instrumental in the event's organization and agenda creation, as well as hosting the keynotes. Now, between them, we have viewpoints from academia, government, NGOs, and industry. So over the next hour, I'll ask each of my guests to introduce themselves and highlight one concept or issue that they see as particularly salient. And then we'll build from there in a conversation touching on some of the highlights and exploring what we can usefully do today based on our awareness of what's coming next. So this webinar is structured essentially as a conversation, and we'd love to hear your input. So please share your thoughts and questions as we go. You'll find a Q&A button under your video feed, so feel free to use it. I'll do my best to weave your questions into the discussion, and then we'll aim to build in some time for questions towards the end as well. I'm sure you'll all be taking careful notes from the webinar, but in case you miss a bit, we will be making a recording available on the 6G World website from Thursday at the latest, so feel free to pop back and review that. So with those foundations laid, Tommaso, you were one of the organizing committee for the 6G Symposium. Were there any surprises in the content for you? And can I ask you maybe to outline one thing that really stood out for you in that?
Yes, Alex, thanks. Well, I wouldn't say that there were, real key surprises. I thought that the symposium was extremely engaging and exciting, as you mentioned. Over 60 experts, long discussions, discussions that span technical aspects as well as societal impact and business aspects of how 6G will really affect all aspects of the economy. One of the keynote speakers highlighted exactly that, the fact that 6G will have a strong impact on all of the aspects of the economy. I think from a technical point of view, it really covered a lot of some of the most exciting and interesting and challenging areas today, from satellite services to non-terrestrial networks, aspects related to Open RAN, the role that Open RAN will play in 6G, the role of AI/ML, cloud and edge, which are all interconnected for sure, right? And specifically, the area of Open RAN is very close to my research interests. I thought that the conversation around Open RAN was especially interesting and engaging. We had a conversation between, traditional manufacturer, was a representative from Ericsson, Open RAN manufacturers, Mavenir, and then Keysight and VIAV, who represents, very important parts of the Open RAN ecosystem with the metrology and measurements, etc. I like specifically the fact that the conversation shifted from the role of Open RAN as only an enabler for interoperability, which is a key aspect of Open RAN, but I don't think it represents the whole story. It was a very interesting discussion on the role that of Open RAN as an enabler for zero-touch control of the network, and autonomous configuration of the network. The role that Open RAN will play in enabling by means of the RAN intelligent controller abstraction, so this centralized abstraction that exposes all these functionalities for the creation of X apps and R apps, how this can really modify how we conceive the networks and enable bespoke services for specific applications and in specific environments. I think that's revolutionary. And I think what was also quite interesting is that our panelists didn't shy away from really thinking about timelines for how this will happen and when this will happen. And they highlighted the fact that while there are operators that are today deploying cloud native and Open RAN networks like Dish and Rakuten, we'll probably have to wait until 2026, 2028 for 50% of the network to be built based on Open RAN concepts. And that's very much in line with timeline for 6G. So I think that this will be a core and key aspects of 6G.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Tommaso. And that's definitely something that I think we'll come back to a bit later on. But I'd like to turn to ATIS's Mike Narocki. Mike, your keynote gave a sense of the purpose and role of the NextG Alliance. But in brief, for those who missed it, can you give us a sense of what you think needs to be different in how ATIS works towards 6G compared to previous generations, and what those key points that you were able to share were?
Thanks, Alex. Even setting aside the NextG Alliance, just thinking about the approach and kind of what I took away from listening to all the great speakers and panelists, I think what I heard was really this great commitment at a national level, at a regional level. And I think there's a difference between cooperation and commitment. I think, cooperation, of course, is sharing ideas, making contributions, and kind of respecting each other's boundaries. But what I heard from the conference, as well as kind of the core belief of the NextG Alliance, is that we really need a collective or shared commitment. Meaning we have a common mission, we have a common set of goals that we're all in this together in terms of advancing a really robust 6G marketplace, as well as advancing North American leadership. So I think that's probably the biggest takeaway. And I guess I'll just add one more point. When we launched the NextG Alliance, I guess we kind of wondered, were we kind of one beat ahead of the industry, of the ecosystem? But what we found out very quickly is we were kind of exactly at the right time, because I think there's this common recognition that we need this collective approach, 8, 9, 10 years in advance of when the technology will be heavily commercialized. So I think those were the biggest takeaways from the symposium itself.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike. And speaking of different approaches, Commissioner Michael O'Reilly, your conversation with Jonathan Adelstein pulled no punches, talking about the need for a change in government and regulatory approaches, and especially as regards spectrum and infrastructure. Can you give us a sense of the most pressing changes needed in your view, and whether the audience is going to be able to influence this at all?
Well, and Jonathan and I approached this from a policy perspective and backgrounds that we share. And I think we looked at it kind of in two parts. First is, how do we look upon 6G and what are our views? And we both see it as it's a journey, not a sprint. It's going to take the timelines that my two colleagues already mentioned, 2030 kind of a timeline. It's going to require, and what I took away from the symposium, which was very interesting, was kind of the engagement and the collaboration. And it's going to take all of the hands on deck to make this work. It's industry, it's government, it's academia working together to make this happen, and trying not to do so it's not a competitive environment at the moment. It is, how do we, how is that commitment that Mike just spoke about? And so then it gets into, okay, then we get into the policy issues that Jonathan and I know so well. And it still bleeds into some of the 5G issues. Spectrum, what bands are we talking about for both 5G mid-band, and what are we going to need for 6G in the upper bands, above 70, above 100? We got into infrastructure issues and investment that the United States is making, and the Congress is engaged in. We got into workforce issues and permitting and rights of way. And then we got into the details of Open RAN and what are components there. And so I think the takeaway was really interesting from our session, and the overall was how engaged people are 10 years out and how involved they are. And that's really healthy, and how they are working together, given the nature of the industry and how competitive it can be. So those are very good signs from our perspective that we saw.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michael. And I'll definitely come back to those concepts around collaboration and commitment. But first, I'd be keen to hear from our final panelist, Doug Castor of InterDigital, last but not least, of course. Doug, you and Tommaso were the driving forces behind the event this year and last year. Did you get a sense of whether the overall 6G conversation has moved on in the past 12 months at all? And if so, how that's happening?
Well, yeah, in terms of moving on, so thank you, Alex. I mean, honestly, I feel like the conversation hasn't moved as fast as it could has, or at least at the same speed that we saw innovation happening 10 years ago with 5G. I was heavily involved in the millimeter wave 5G investigations, and we saw more of a rapid pace with the measurement campaigns at NYU, and we saw some test bed work and advanced standards and all the demonstrations. So I think 6G, I think if 6G compared to last year, we are still hearing some of the same when it comes to like the use cases and the technologies. And I would have hoped that we've seen more results in terms of the technology breakthroughs. So I think in terms of results, it's been a little bit of more of a quieter year than I would have hoped. Maybe this because of the pandemic, but maybe because of all the companies are really quietly working on solutions in early stages, and I know that's what we are doing here at InterDigital. But I do think, just kind of echoing what like Mike had said, I do think that we have progressed very well in bringing the ecosystem out. The formation of research and interest groups have really formed well over the last year or so. The 6G framework is much better organized than it was 12 months ago, with NextG Alliance and the NSF Rings project. So it's coming together, and I'm hoping that as we go forward, we're going to be hearing more and more about the results of 6G.
Brilliant, thanks, Doug. And actually, this idea of movement and change is something I'd like to open up to the wider group too, because you all have very different perspectives. I mean, for example, Michael, you were in the FCC in 2020, I think. So was anything after 5G on your radar at all at that time?
Yeah, so there was, during my ending years, there was a conversation about 6G, what it would look like. I mean, I think that's the perennial question of, how to define it, and what does it look like in the standard setting bodies. And so that was occurring at the very early stages. But in fairness, and to Doug's point, a lot of entities, a lot of folks that we were speaking with were still buried in 5G and still, in the early stages, and trying to convince, by the time you got to our stage, it wasn't the technology side. It was, okay, now it's use cases, and it's how do we monetize? And then what does that mean for public policy in terms of deadlines and obligations and the push-pull and that respective. So 5G is very much on the mind. And so we're still talking, certainly the commission is still talking mid-band spectrum. How do we make more available in the United States for 5G? And then what does that mean for 6G? But we're aggressive in making spectrum available for 6G, so the higher bands, and some of the decisions to go. So it was on our minds. It maybe not at the forefront, but it was still there.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Michael. And I mean, Mike, obviously the 6G Alliance was only officially announced at the start of this year. So I imagine that this past 12 months has been pretty hectic for ATIS from that standpoint to be getting organized.
It has, Alex, and but also recognize, we grew from about 16 founding members at the end of last year to 70, and we've got over 600 people now engaged from industry and from academia, and now the government agencies beginning to join the alliance. So I think there's this common recognition, and when we talk about 5G and 6G, I think in the past, marketplace has always been most successful when we see kind of a good blending of revolution and evolution. And I think that's probably where we will find ourselves at the end of the decade. Success of mobile generation technology, not replacement technologies. And so we often ask the question, well, what will 6G do that 5G will not? But we also have to think in terms of how 6G can build on the successes of 5G. And so that's the reason we've really just kind of adopted more of a vision, an end of decade vision, because, as scientists and technologists and engineers, we always think in terms of sequences and releases, and we build boundaries around things. But if you just step back and you think from a visionary standpoint, an aspirational standpoint, what would we want this marketplace to look like? And the reality is we'll have the kind of the beginning of 5G deployment, we'll have the long tail evolution of 5G, and we'll already be thinking about the end beyond. So it's really more an aspirational look from a visionary standpoint versus thinking strictly in terms of things like releases.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks, Mike. And that actually takes me on quite neatly to my next question. I think during the symposium there were quite a few conversations in different contexts around the role of 5G, its evolution, and its relationship to 6G, and topics around, for example, edge computing networks, strong rural access, Open RAN, and so on, and various comments that 6G might be what delivers on the promise of 5G, for example. I guess my question is, actually, are we any closer to a consensus on what 6G might be or look like, and how that relates to 5G? Because that may be, to Doug's point, why this is slowing down some of these announcements around particular technology developments. Tommaso, can I start with you on this idea of what consensus might look like?
Yeah, that's a tough question, because everybody has somewhat different opinions. But I think that there is certainly consensus that at least in terms of the early stages of research, there will be an attempt to go to even higher frequency bands that then characterize the 5G, right? So all the work that is happening on the sub-terahertz frequency bands, that's we don't know whether, it's research, right? So we don't know whether that will be successful, at least within the time span that separates us from the early deployments of 6G. But certainly that's going to be a strong focus, and I think that there is consensus on that. There is less consensus on whether that will be successful, but that's the beauty of I think of research. I also think that all the discussions around Open RAN, right? Yes, there are cloud native networks that are being deployed today, but we're far from unleashing the real potential of fully open, virtualized, and programmable and AI-driven networks. So I think that will be a core 6G topic. And last, I think the whole area of spectrum sharing, right? Obviously, there's been lots of discussions on spectrum sharing in the context, especially of CBRS, the CBRS band for 5G, but that will certainly become a key topic in the next few years when with the explosion in data services. So I think that if I were to try to separate what would be the core 6G research topic, I would outline these three.
Brilliant, thanks.
Yeah, maybe I could just add to my view of 5G in the context of what it means for 6G. I think 5G is really just whetting the appetite for all the new markets that we're going to see coming in 6G. And 6G is going to, I think, add new features to really make those markets great. 5G was really about flexibility, scalability. We had flexible numerologies, flexible to support services such as URLLC, and just being able to reach more bands than ever before. right? So 5G is this excellent framework to get new verticals involved in the cellular industry, into cellular technologies. And 5G is really enabling these new markets, and it's not going to be just about the smartphone anymore. It's going to be about connected sensors, smart cities, smart home, remote monitoring, robots, or robot assistants we see as well. So when we look at what 5G, what we're going to see, these new verticals come in, kind of whet their appetite on 5G, but 6G I think will really fully make this a booming market, and we'll add new features. We'll learn from 5G and continue adding features on that in 6G.
Yeah, can I just jump in there and say, I think one of Doug's last sentence had the word learn. I think we're going to learn a lot as we go from 5G to 6G, because and 4G is still going to be a component. It's certainly in many parts of the United States. It's not going away when we went to 5G, and it's not going to go away when we get to 6G. They're going to play specific roles. But I think of Thomas Rowe's point in terms of CBRS, I think, I remember when many people told me there was no way that CBRS was going to be used for 5G. That it was just never, and I disagreed, and we had these debates at the FCC, and now you see where we are. It may be a slightly component of 5G. It may not be used in the broadest sense, but in private 5G networks that are being expanded upon in CBRS is really growing substantially. And so I think there's going to be a learning to go, and that certainly plays off the what's the marketplace, what's the monetization, what are the features and functions that Doug mentioned.
Excellent, thanks, Michael, and to the rest of you too. It actually feeds in some of this to some of the questions that are already coming in, relating to not just the higher frequencies and whether we should be whether there are other elements of 6G that people ought to be focusing on. But it kind of ties into a very striking conversation, I think, that arose during the symposium around the role of those higher frequencies and the centrality of them versus other ways to work with spectrum, in terms of, for example, that sharing and different approaches towards using spectrum. So, I mean, maybe since you mentioned that last, Michael, maybe from your perspective, looking at it from from that sort of regulatory angle or policy angle, should we be thinking more about sharing across industries in either existing frequency bands or using the existing frequency in different spectrum in different ways? For example, how we auction it or how that's used.
Yeah, so when I look upon, the sharing conversation is going to continue to increase, and that's productive. I think as you go higher in the frequency bands and you head to, 100 gigahertz, I think sharing becomes a much more easier projection than it is in the lower. But I don't know that I break in terms of the formulation I've consistently had, which is you're still going to need licensed spectrum, certainly in the 5G world. The carriers, and operators, and whoever's, in that phase wants licensed spectrum. Even those using unlicensed are still in the CBRS model, or the the unlicensed like spectrum. The GAA would like some licensed spectrum, so they're still going to need that. There's still going to be auctions for the exclusive use of licenses. You're still going to need to, and that gets to the conversation of making more mid-band spectrum available. The 3.1 to 3.45. A portion of the spectrum band used mostly by DoD, we're going to have to open that up. And some of that's going to be for sharing, some of that's going to be for exclusive use, and some of it may be exclusive use for just DoD. But it's going to be a flavor of that, and sharing is going to be a component of that. And certainly as you go higher, sharing will be more of a conversation because it's easier thing to do, from my understanding.
I liked Bill Foster's comment when he was speaking, brought up the idea of using CBRS for satellite, right? Because when the satellites come over top, right, you can know ahead of time when this frequency band is not available because there's some kind of satellite radar sensing happening. So that was really, really interesting to hear, the thinking at that level.
Brilliant, thanks. And in terms of, before we move on from this sort of spectrum idea, I just want to check, Mike, is this something that you're looking at with the Next G Alliance? And if there are any initial thoughts or recommendations from your side?
Yes, this is absolutely something we're thinking about. In fact, we've got a spectrum working group that's been established. Spectrum is always this complex area of business policy, technology, because on the one hand, you want all the innovative thinking many years in advance. You want to think about the policies. You want to do the experimentation. On the other hand, spectrum should not be a solution then that kind of is laid out in advance of understanding the application space. So, as you think about things like holographic services and so on, what would be the spectrum requirements? There'd be certain metrics and KPIs that would be driven by the applications, by this new marketplace that relies a great deal on the surrounding environment. So you kind of have to work spectrum from both sides. You have to do all the advanced thinking because this takes many years to kind of play itself out in the marketplace. On the other hand, you don't want to kind of invent solutions before you really understand what the core market drivers will be.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Mike. There's something that I've heard in conversation a few times, which seems to kind of almost counteract this idea of talking about the use cases. People commenting, for example, about how we didn't expect SMS to be the success in 2G that it was, and so on, as though we should just roll out these technologies and see what happens with them in terms of uptake and so on. I'm just wondering, playing devil's advocate, the telcos weren't the people to capitalize on applications in 3G really, or video in 4G. So, I mean, is there an argument for coming at the design of 6G from a much more commercial focus and involving, I guess, industries who could be the end users more early on? And I know that's a controversial one. Tommaso, I'm going to steer that to you first, because I know from that very early research side of things, that's maybe something that you've been thinking about.
Yeah, it's possible, Alex, that that some technical innovations may come from involving some of the end users early on. It seems to me like, and I'm maybe proven wrong here, but that in the previous generations, it's more like the technical capabilities that were made available by the generations resulted in some new applications that had not necessarily been, that people didn't necessarily have in mind when they were conceiving the technology, right? I'm thinking about, for example, things like Uber and Netflix, right? That really radically changed the way we live. They were enabled by specific generations of cellular connectivity, right? But that being said, they were not necessarily the initial drivers for the technical conversation that resulted in the standardization, etc. But history doesn't necessarily need to repeat itself. So maybe different models and approaches.
I think it's hard though. I think it's really hard though for the end user or the industry that's not engaged as much on these to try and lead or push some of these conversations. I think that panelists have highlighted how the new technology may have taken a direction we weren't expecting, and new entrants may have taken advantage of it, but to be the lead push from that is kind of, or leader is kind of difficult. I remember, a generation ago, and at least in my career, I was in the early part, we were implementing 3G, and I was asking the questions about 4G. Okay, everyone knew at the time 4G, we had talked about some of the standards, we knew was full, capable of full motion video. But it wasn't, nobody was then going, oh, there's a Netflix going to take advantage of this. Why didn't the telcos have a more engaging role in at the time in making a video product? That's a question maybe, for historians, but it is harder for someone to try and figure out from the use case backwards. I mean, did we know at the time that the 5G was going to lead with, and I open to discussion, but I think people talk about industrialization when everyone else was talking about, open heart remote surgery. It was the, industrialization and control of manufacturing and a bunch of other things that are actually seem to be leading the chase here on 5G.
Right. And it's very hard to build a business model or a product based on capabilities that don't exist, right? That are a few years. So you're like, it's really a chicken and egg problem.
Yeah, but I think
I'll just
go ahead, Mike.
I'll just add one additional point. You talk about innovation, so obviously you can't specify innovation, you can't standardize innovation, but what you can do is you can deploy, innovation platforms. So as we think about 6G, and we have a better understanding of what the surrounding environment will be, right? It'll be kind of contextual, it'll be context aware, it'll be predictive. Then you develop basically kind of a roadmap of 6G that leads to a commercialization that creates this innovation platform, but takes into account the surrounding environment. And I think that's very possible given the time we have to develop 6G at this stage.
Yes, I was just going to say from the perspective of what we see in 3GPP, we see a lot of the new industries. I wouldn't say that the users are in terms of the stakeholders, but you have you have the automotive companies becoming involved in 3GPP. You have the satellite industry becoming involved. So I think it's important that we see the standardization move to the direction of bringing in more of the stakeholders that will be important for defining these new use cases, and and to see that increasingly more than just like at the requirement definition stage is what we see now, right? We see a lot of new participants in the requirements defining groups in 3GPP, but not so much of down in the RAN and getting fully engaged head to toe through the standardization process. So and I know that's not, that's a stretch because the verticals don't always have the resources to be sending to 3GPP meetings, but if we can be working more tightly with them throughout the industry, I think that will really help us address the needs for 6G and the broader stakeholders.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Doug. Actually, related to that, we've had a question come in talking about the standards process for 6G and how we can get small companies to be encouraged to participate in the development of these standards. And I guess that applies, both for smaller companies within the established telecoms environment, but also you could also look at that from the participation of players from outside that traditional telco industry who want to have a say in what's being developed and how. Yeah, it would be really good to gain the panel's perspective, I think, on whether the standards process does need to evolve or what could be done better, maybe to bring in this sort of wider set of perspectives. I mean, I don't know, Mike, if this is something that you're comfortable commenting on.
Yes, well, the traditional organization where the specifications have been developed around mobile generation technology is 3GPP. I mean, by its nature, it's dominated by kind of the big countries, many of the bigger players in industry and so on, because it is very resource intensive, travel intensive, and so on. We begin to explore new ways, continue to explore new ways for the small and mid-sized companies to participate in this process. And we're very open to having a conversation between industry and government and academia around that. But I think the Next G Alliance is a place where these companies are engaging now in terms of the thought process that eventually some of this will find its way into the standards development process as well. So there are various mechanisms where small and mid-sized companies can engage in a thought process, even if they don't have the ability to devote all the significant resources it takes to develop global interoperability standards.
Yeah, I just have maybe two thoughts to this. One is that now is a better time than ever for new companies to become involved in standards, because they're all virtual meetings at this point. So to get started, now in the next 6 months, there's still going to be a lot of virtual meetings for 3GPP. But my second thought on this is that I think that when it comes to some of the government-funded initiatives that are driving funding of advanced wireless in North America, I'd like to see more of that funding geared towards pulling together industry and academia and focused on how we can get the technology and the standards. I think there's a much more efficient way that some of this can be done if we think about making sure there's much more tighter integration between some of the research that we do in academia, and how do we make sure that all that work isn't wasted and that we don't get lost in what I think of as like this valley of death, where you have this gap between academia funded work and the commercialization in industry. So to streamline that process, I think is one way that we can help make things more efficiently. And then small companies, I see the question was geared towards small companies. Small companies can be involved in that process as well.
Can I want to absolutely agree to Doug's point. Yeah, so I would say I absolutely agree to Doug's point at the end. I mean, the collaboration is essential to prevent the gaps and prevent duplicity and prevent the constant competitive environment that we want, and the offering of services, not necessarily in terms of the development in the early stages. And to the other point, I think is very valid. Never before has there been so many eyes on the standardization process. 3GPP is now, it's not only in terms of companies engaging, but it is it's a global geopolitical issue being explored in terms of its makeup and the elections, and I was part of that process and making sure that it was open and fair, and that's a difficult universe to be. No one at the time expected the standardization process where you want the science and math and the submissions and the technology and the IP to drive to be dragged into the muck of traditional government and political issues. So that to me is something that's new. And so if I'm a smaller, if you're a small provider, that's hard to enter, and it always will be. And that being small has got its benefits, and being nimble and small makes it difficult to participate in some of these things. The resources needed to participate in standardization, incredibly essential, but they can also be the same company that gets, that trips over itself because of bureaucracy. So there are benefits and negatives about being big, and the same about being small. So there's only so much you can do about that going forward.
Just wanted to add that I completely agree with Doug on the point of ecosystems of collaboration between industry and academia, and making sure that whatever the outcome of these collaborations go into, they don't fall into the valley of death. And I would also like to add that I think it's a great time now for collaborations between academia and industry. There is renewed interest. I would say both within academia in working with industry, and seeing real world outcomes for what gets produced in the lab, and there is renewed interest from industry in working with academia. We've seen that growing in the past couple of years significantly with the rollout of 5G and with the early conversations around 6G, and I think that's great. It's also new programs within the government, the programs that have been ongoing for the past few years that put a strong emphasis in collaboration between government, academia, and industry. One of them, and I'd like to mention that, is the Platform for Advanced Wireless Research Program, PAWR, spearheaded by the National Science Foundation with a significant investment, and with a large consortium of industry players from our wireless and computing ecosystem to create 4 national test beds for advanced wireless research. 3 of them are operational as of today, and they're an excellent playground for collaboration between academia and industry for testing new solutions and bringing them to fruition. And also the NSF RINGS program that Doug mentioned earlier. That is, I believe, in the history of the National Science Foundation, the program that has brought the largest number of industry players to collaborate with the foundation in a single program. And that's great. It's all happening in the area of wireless and advanced wireless systems. And last, I'd like to mention the new directorate that the National Science Foundation will be starting. It's expected it will be focused on technology translation, so getting basic research into the real world, closer to industry, impact on the economy, etc. It's expected again that it will be primarily by means of collaborations between industry, academia, government, and local communities. And I think that's really the creation of these innovation ecosystems will be crucial for the future of wireless and for our competitiveness as a North American ecosystem.
Brilliant, thanks guys. And this idea of collaboration across different stakeholder groups is something that I know has been mentioned kind of in passing to some degree already a few times. We've had a question in which I think is a really good point, and that's that 5G brought in the involvement of hyperscalers and cloud players alongside telco, which is
oh, did we lose Alex?
I think we might have.
Which means I guess we're on our own. Well, we should probably.
Do you want to take that? Do you want to take that question, Doug? Can you?
Yeah, I think where he was going was that the question is about hyperscalers, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I mean, I think the integration of compute and communications really has been one of the key themes for 5G, and will extend into 6G. There's some use cases require that computing is done right at the edge, and things like autonomous driving, safety applications, running in the distant cloud. You wouldn't want your autonomous vehicle to be putting that safety application in the distance cloud, for instance. So we see a lot of trends towards edge computing, right? And this was something that 3GPP started getting involved in the current releases that are being discussed now, release 17, release 18, and it looks like we're going to see more of these improvements coming for release 18. And I look at this as really just like location services has been a huge revenue source for the industry. Well, edge services that can be offered by the 5G system will also be a huge revenue source for the industry. So support for the edge impacts all parts of the system, the core network, the RAN, the devices as well. Devices can be edge servers as well. So I think I think that that's kind of where we'll see this the industry move when it comes to getting some of the cloud players involved and the edge computing as well. So Alex is back. I think we covered at least my response to the hyperscaler and telco question.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Doug. I appreciate that. The joys of technology. When it works, it's perfect. When it doesn't, it's alarming.
No problem.
Yeah, I'd be interested to get a sense as to whether you see any sort of potential new stakeholder groups coming in, sort of in addition to those that we were already seeing in this expanding ecosystem. I mean, we've mentioned, for example, automotive, cloud, and so on, and whether this spread of new stakeholders should lead to different approaches to how we look to develop 6G. So for example, whether this is going to involve more collaboration, let's say, across different regulatory bodies. If we're looking to integrate more closely with, let's say, drones, does that involve the aviation, or so on? And equally, in terms of the development of use cases and so on, do we need to be bringing in different industries at this stage when we're developing?
Well, I'll just add a comment on that. I think, first of all, the development of 6G standards, of 6G solutions, so on, should be overall inclusive. But I think we should also think about, in terms of the industries that are maybe had not traditionally been at the table, we should think about what are some of the industries, in this nation, in this region, that are key to the success, economic success, societal success, and so on. So we're seeing new industries, certainly telehealth is one area that could be tremendously advanced through 6G. Areas like smart agriculture, where basically, you're relying on kind of very ultra high definition, high positioning type of solutions, of also kind of a network of networks type of approach in many cases. So I think it's a combination of basically inviting all industries that can benefit from 6G, but then also thinking at more of a national level about what are some of the key industries that can both help to support 6G and gain benefit from 6G.
Thanks, Mike. And I guess when you're talking about that and the idea of industries such as agriculture and so on using 6G as a benefit, and the evolution from 5G and so on, I know we had a couple of commissioners and congressmen in the symposium talking about this drive for greater reliability, greater coverage, and so on, which might come through 5G and then evolve into 6G. But in some ways, it does sound like almost it's not a technology question. It's not that kind of evolution, but more something that's involved with a sort of political or social evolution. And I wonder if we should be looking in parallel at these kinds of technology visions, along with sort of societal and business concerns. And I'm going to sort of point this towards Michael in the first instance, simply because I know you've already been dealing with some of that historically.
Yeah.
And how do you tie that together?
Well, a couple of things. It's great that there are challenges presented and and we like to see technology solve some of those problems, but I don't know that it becomes the government's role to kind of shift and the technology towards one particular direction. I think the industry is trying to figure out how best to serve particular markets. Maybe they're getting more niche as we go, or niche as we go forward. And I think you see that in some of that's what I view in the release 18, and we get to more specifics. I think some of the difficulty is it's been a fight for the last, in 5G, it's somewhat of an internal fight over who's going to control the system, who's going to control the network, right? Is industrialization going to be the manufacturers, or is it going to be the telcos? Is it going to be in high G farming? Is it going to be the industry, or is it going to be the telcos? You see those tensions, automobile is a great example where, is it going to be the traditional automobile makers, manufacturers, or is it going to be telcos? And that kind of tension is difficult to try and solve some of the social political issues that you talked about. You saw the same thing with building owners trying to figure out if they were going to become the new telco within the building, and they realized they didn't want to. And what I always remind everyone, is that becoming, offering these services as a wireless player is much more complicated than you think. And you may have a service, and you may know your universe very well. Telehealth, you may know the health industry, you may know the agriculture industry very well, but being a telco provider or providing a wireless network is much more complicated than you can imagine. And so trying to dominate that to solve a political issue is difficult going forward.
That's
also,
very
I'll just add one more point on top of Michael's comments. I think if you look at the last 2 years, and you think in terms of telework, and you think in terms of teleeducation and telehealth and so on, I think first of all, it demonstrates the real value that these solutions and networks have brought to the market. Where would we be over the last 2 years without that? But I think it also points out there's a delta between the kind of the flat screen experience and the human-to-human experience. And so I think we have a better understanding what that delta is at this point, and kind of where we need to go in terms of 6G, helping us solve that in terms of, multi-sensory applications, holographic applications, and so on. So I think in some sense, I think we have at least a better pointer, I think, to the future in terms of where this development can happen.
Fantastic. I mean, when we're talking about this idea of a pointer towards the future, there are quite a few times during the symposium, the concept was mentioned of getting the workforce, the skills that it's going to require. Tommaso, for example, you were mentioning the idea of a much more AI-driven, cloud-centric network, and these things are really exciting, but it's going to be constrained by whether we have people that can operate these things and maintain them, I would guess. So my question is really, how should we be thinking about getting those skills out there? I mean, is it too early to be thinking about this? And who would be the right people to be turning to, I guess, to look at this? I mean, would this be driven from the universities, Tommaso, or is this something that we need to be thinking about more holistically?
Thanks, I think this is a great question, and I can tell you that. So you asked whether is it too early to start thinking about this, or is that? I think time is now, and I have some evidence of that. I mean, I have we have industry approaching us, asking us, where do we find engineers that are trained with this and this skill? Because that's different from what academia was doing in the past, right? So in the past, for example, very simple example, right? The area of communications and the area of computing, cloud, were two completely different areas. One is typically an electrical engineering curriculum. The other one is either a computer science or a computer engineering curriculum, right? And in academia, these are by and large separate, and you don't find necessarily engineers and practitioners that are trained with the right skills, right? So I think it's definitely important that we have these conversations across industry and academia, so that we can conceive innovative programs that will prepare the workforce of tomorrow, at all levels, right? At the bachelor level, but also at the master's, PhD level, and also with what at Northeastern we've been using this expression through gray. So providing educational experience for professionals in the field, so that they can be up to date with what is happening in this complex ecosystems that includes everything from circuits to signal processing to AI, ML, computing, but also a lot of understanding of some of the applications that will be enabled by this. So I think my take is certainly academia has an important role to play, but we need to be talking with industry more than what we've been doing in the past few years.
Now, I totally agree with Tommaso's comments, but I also think, you know, some of these skill sets will probably need to be required, you know, prior to collegiate level, right? High schools, maybe even middle schools. And I guess the second observation would be, you know, traditionally we think of these skill sets and then kind of contributing to either the area of research or contributing to within industry to the communications or the information career set. But I think some of these skill sets will also be required. We've been talking about all these vertical and adjoining industries and so on. These skill sets will also have to find their way into all of these other industries, whether it be, you know, transportation or food supply, you know, the entertainment business. There'll be, you know, numerous opportunities to support 6G like skill sets in many industries.
Excellent. Michael, I see you sort of nodding along there. So,
yeah,
you know,
I absolutely agree.
How do you
agree with Mike's point? You know, and Thomas's point to some degree. We do look to universities heavily for these purposes, and know that the curriculum is going to need to change. I think my only caution is that if people look to government to solve some of these things, I think they might be sadly mistaken. You know, government's more reactive, and though we can talk about workforce issues, but they're more on the immediate of infrastructure deployment. How do you get, you know, how do you train? How do you do some of the, you know, how do you convert from, you know, a university type mechanism to more trade universes and trade schools? And so I think that's a difficult for government to shift, and the mindset to, it just takes quite a while. So you look to the nimbleness of industry working with particular universities and in getting it into the middle school curriculum. That's a challenge. I'll admit that's a heavy lift, but they're absolutely necessary. And it's going to be not just the traditional telco or the cloud universe or the IT. It is going to bleed into every single segment of our business cycle.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michael. Now, I realize we're coming up to the top of the hour. So I'd like to take advantage of the fact that we do have representatives here with expertise across academia, public sector, private sector, and NGOs. So just really to get your crystal balls out for the next 12 months and get a sense for what you see as you know, your top priorities for the coming year when we're looking at putting in this groundwork for 6G, or if not your top priority, maybe what you consider should be the top priority for your peers. Doug, maybe I can start with you.
Yeah. So maybe I guess I mentioned earlier on in the conversation that I felt that this past year has been a little bit dry in terms of results. So really, I think the top priority that I see is results. Right, next year we really need to look at showcasing what some of the key research that has been done, and what can it do for us to take us to 6G. You know, there's been a lot of talk about use cases and vision, and I think we just need to tack that up on the wall quickly and refine it as we go. You know, and let's just focus on groundbreaking results that we can, you know, that we can build the intuition that the visions are possible.
Excellent, thanks. Tommaso, over to you.
I agree with Doug, and we've had sessions on that before, and I think that I agree 100% with what he said.
Fantastic. Mike, what's your aim going to be with the Next Year Alliance?
Well, from the standpoint of the Alliance, our initial focus will be on getting a vision and roadmap document out at the beginning of the year, and then drilling down from there to much more detail. But I think, you know, we need this kind of original initial marker pointer that we can build upon, and it then at that point it can then become a kind of a point of commitment as we move ahead.
Yeah, understood. And Michael, sort of in terms of policy objectives, if you're putting pressure on people in power, what is it that you'd be advising them to do or to be thinking about?
Well, I'd like to see, government more engaged than it is. Certainly NSF has been actively involved, as we talked about, but there's much more layers. Congress is aware, and you had them in the symposium as part of the conversation. Great, but I'd like to see much more mature conversation, much more in-depth conversation, and really examining the results that Doug mentioned. So I think it's really in a year, I hope that conversation is much more mature.
Fantastic, thanks. And with that, we're coming up to time. So it just remains for me to thank Michael, Mike, Tommaso, and Doug, as well as you out there in the audience, for all of your questions and comments. Now, remember, if you want to see the recording, it will be available on the 6G World site from Thursday, along with plenty more great material. So if you have questions, comments, or suggestions, feel free to get in touch through the website. We'd love to hear what you're doing, what you're thinking, and take some of those questions. But for now, thank you and goodbye.